Good morning, brethren, and welcome to our live program entitled A Glance at the Word, which is broadcast every Monday and every Wednesday at 8:30 a.m. West Africa time, which is GMT +1. The title of our topic this morning is Cultivating the Presence of God Through Worship. Cultivating the presence of God through worship. Let's read John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. There are two major types of worshippers: true worshippers and false worshippers, according to what we have just read, of course. False worshippers are either idol worshippers or those who worship God in a wrong way. True worshippers are those who actually worship God in the right way. Worshipping God in the right way implies taking into account the very nature of God. Jesus explained to us the nature of God. Jesus said, God is spirit. Thus, to worship God, we must take into account the fact that God is spirit. You can't worship the spirit in the same way as if he were a physical being. As Jesus stated it clearly, to worship the spirit, you must worship him in spirit. And not only in spirit, but in spirit and truth. Only similar elements can be joined together. Only similar elements can be in perfect communion. So true worshippers worship God in spirit and in truth. This is why true worshippers hold worship services. Worshipping God means honoring God and acknowledging his dignity, his greatness, and his majesty. Worshipping God means giving God deep reverence and magnificence. Let's now read in the Old Testament the book of Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With two he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. So I said, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal which he had taken with the tongues from the altar. Anyway, we went even further than what I wanted to show you, but that's not a problem. Worshiping God is just like a representation of the cross of Jesus Christ in our lives. The cross have two beams, a vertical beam and a horizontal beam. The vertical beam of the worshiping cross represents the glory of God. True worship must focus on the greatness and power of God, on the majesty of God, on the love of God, on the goodness of God. True worship must glorify God. True worshipers worship God in spirit and in truth. Let's now read 1 Corinthians chapter 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 12 to 14. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 12 to 14. For as the body is one and has many members, but all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and have all been made to drink into one Spirit. For in fact the body is not one member, but many. Let's also read, still in the book of 1 Corinthians, let's read chapter 14, verses 25 and 26. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 25 and 26. And thus the secrets of his heart are revealed, and so falling down on his face, he will worship God and report that God is truly among you. How is it then, brethren, whenever you come together, each of you has a psalm, has a teaching, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification. So we said that true worship is like the cross of Jesus. And we said that the vertical beam represents the glory of God. Now, the horizontal beam of the worshiping cross stands for the edification of the church. Through worship, we are bred and strengthened, living in communion with each other in the service of God. Let's now see what the characteristics of a good worship service are. A worship service is always done in God's presence, for God is actually present in his church. Let's see what God says in the book of John chapter 4, verse 24, that we already read. We're going to read it again, just that verse 24. It says, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. As Jesus tells us, a good worship service is always done in spirit and truth. This implies genuine adoration, the truth of the word of God. Let's now read Genesis chapter 8. Genesis chapter 8, verses 20 to 21. Genesis chapter 8, verses 20 to 21. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelt a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. Let's also read Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 and 9. Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 and 9. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, and as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, and all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. The worship service is made of a relationship of God speaks to his people, and the people answer their God. Let's now see what is worship. When we search the word of God, we depict 7 categories of worshipers, or of people who are meant to worship God. So those who are meant to worship God are, first of all, the whole creation. As we can read, but we're not going to read it. I'm just going to give you references. You can read it all alone. In Psalm 96, verses 11 to 13. Psalm 98, verses 7 to 9. And Psalm 103, verse 22. Secondly, the angels of God, they too are meant to worship God, and they do it. And that one we read in Psalm 103, verse 20, and in Revelation chapter 5, verses 11 and 12. Thirdly, the princes and kings of the world, as we read in Psalm chapter 148, verses 11 to 13. Fourthly, the nations of the world, as we read in Psalm 117, verse 1, and in Romans chapter 15, verses 9 to 12. Number 5, every knee and every tongue to the glory of God, as it is written in the book of Philippians chapter 2, verses 9 to 11. Number 6, all the redeemed people of God who were gathered by his word and his spirit. Number 7, young men and maidens, as well as old men and children, as we read in Psalm 148, verses 12 and 13. So as you see, my brethren, the whole creation of God is meant to worship God, is meant to acknowledge the greatness of God, is meant to acknowledge the awe of God, is meant to acknowledge the glory, the greatness, the goodness, all the being of God. So the whole creation must worship God. You must worship God. I must worship God. All of us must worship God. But we must worship him in spirit and in truth, because we have to render him true worship, not false worship or wrong worship. We have not finished our talk. We will continue with the same talk on Wednesday. This program, A Glance at the Word, is broadcast live every Monday and every Wednesday at 8:30 a.m. West Africa time, which is GMT +1. We also have live broadcast in French entitled École de la Sagesse with Bishop Floribert Mawit every Monday at 5:30 p.m. West Africa time, which is GMT +1, and every Tuesday, every Thursday, and every Saturday at 9 a.m. West Africa time, which is GMT +1. We have 2 live broadcast programs in French every Sunday. The first one at 8 a.m. West Africa time. It is called Le Pain de Champion with Bishop Floribert Mawit. And the second is our Sunday service. It is broadcast at 10:15 a.m. West Africa time, which is GMT +1. God bless you beyond all your expectations.